Recording has started.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how to talk to students about AI. And we figured this was a good time to schedule this. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can get it by either typing in that tiny URL or aiming your camera at the QR code. And I think it will ask you if you'd like to make a copy of it. This time we didn't include any viruses or anything. It's just that way you get your own copy if you want to add to it or make notes on it and so forth. And one of the things I've got to stop doing is putting the year of the things in the tiny URL so we can't update the slides later
Oh.
on without creating a thought of that last night. Okay, so, we do have this issue that students are using AI pretty much all the time. Um, this was a study at HEPI, a student generative AI survey, that in 2024, 66% of students were using AI regularly. It was 92% in 2025. There's a more recent survey from England, which puts it at 98%, I think it was, 97 or
Wow.
98%. So it's
So
gone up
virtually all.
quite a bit, virtually all. Some students are very reluctant, and in fact, we've heard that here. We have a student committee on learning and teaching,
Mhm.
and what came up in all of our meetings last year is students concerned that they'll be falsely accused of using AI when they haven't. And we had some pretty strong opinions on that from people who were actually honor students who were accused of using AI when they were actually kind of opposed to the use of AI, and they were kind of offended by it. So many students are reluctant to report it. So when there's a survey done in class, if your students say only like a third of them are using AI regularly, that's because they don't want to admit to it in general. But we do know that employers are expecting people coming into their jobs now in almost all occupations to be able to use AI. And in general, we're not doing that much to prepare students for that world. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking a little bit about this. So, Maggie, you want to?
Sure. One of the first steps we can do to talk with students about AI is write with the syllabus to create a statement that explains to students how AI will be used in course, under which conditions it can be or not be used in the course. And to really take a moment to talk with your students about um, why you may or may not want to use AI, the reasoning behind that, but also talking about the way it can help their learning, help develop skills, and how to use it ethically. So if feasible, you can co-create an AI syllabus statement. We do this with a lot of policies, discussion policies in class. You can do this as a small group activity, giving students an opportunity to talk about their fears related to AI, like some of the students had talked about um, in the oversight, committee that, there's some concerns about, whether they're going to be accused of using AI, but also that different classes are going to have different AI policies. And so for them to really fully engage and understand what your class is going to do, it'd be helpful to include them in that creation.
And one other point along those lines is that students are in 5 classes, and if you just include a
Yes.
syllabus statement, they're not going to remember what the policies are in each and every
Right.
course. And in general, many people will have policies that will differ depending on what types of skills they're working on and what types of applications. So it's useful not only to have a syllabus statement describing the overall policy, preferably one that students can buy into, because if they buy into it, if they recognize that there is some benefit of learning to develop some automaticity
Mhm.
and some basic skills in the discipline, it will make it more likely that they'll refrain from using it inappropriately. But also on each assignment, include those details as well about where AI is used and where it's not, because it's easy for students to forget what's allowed and what isn't, because we remember them for our courses, but
Sure.
students are dealing with more than one course at a time.
Excellent. Part of this can be sharing with your students how you use AI and how you might use it ethically and how you might use it to help build your course. I think a lot of um, a lot of creating that trust in each other and creating an environment where you can be open and have these conversations with each other means, sharing as a educator your own reasons for using AI and how it might be used in your field, for better or for worse, and to help students understand how they might be able to build those skills. Um, again, thinking about your specific disciplines, evaluating the quality of AI output, giving them opportunities to critique AI and to understand what they bring as a human and as a student to the conversation, and using AI to help, um, words I'm looking for, help build off of their work.
And also find out how people in your disciplines are using it. So think about the types of jobs our graduates are getting. Think about people in the discipline in terms
Mhm.
of how they're using AI, and think about how we can perhaps incorporate those specific skills into the class, and also what types of standards there are. In many areas, there are some strict prohibitions on AI use in terms of many creative activities, for example. So,
Sure.
you know, let students know what the current state is. That current state is constantly evolving, so it does require keeping up a bit with what's happening, but it is something that is relevant to students. And if you can show them that you understand how AI is being used in the types of careers that people are currently getting in
Mhm.
your areas, that can be really helpful in helping make a case for whatever policies that you're using.
Yeah.
And then also think about what uniquely human considerations or
Yeah.
contributions students might bring to this. Because, if all students are learning to do is to be able to type prompts and copy the output, it doesn't require a college degree for that. So
Right.
think about what role humans are going to play in this world where we all have access to increasingly powerful AI tools. And among things, there are things like critical thinking and cooperation and creativity and other things,
Mhm.
although AI is getting better at creativity as well.
And right, being able to evaluate the trustworthiness of different information, back to critical thinking, it's all, something they bring to the table.
And one concern that a lot of
Mhm.
people have is the use of AI for cognitive offloading,
Mm.
where a student, when you're first learning something, it's kind of challenging, but that challenge is actually an important part of the learning process. The term desirable difficulties were created by Bjork and Bjork in a psychology paper a while back. There's a lot of similar names for this, but basically what happens is that act of struggling with the material tends to reinforce learning, and it's helpful to build long-term learning. And it's also helping to build that ability to transfer things that you learn in one domain and transfer those concepts or those applications into other areas. So there is a lot of concern that using AI makes it kind of too easy to do work, in which case you don't learn things as
Right.
well. And that challenge is an important part of learning. One other thing I don't think is in the
Oh.
slides, because I, I was tired last night, but is that there was that Derek Ruff provided that keynote address a few days, well, last week.
Mhm.
Yeah, last week. And one of the things he noted was a meta-analysis that was done
Mm.
by a couple of researchers in
Researchers.
Australia. And what the research found is that when AI use is done in classes, is done in a productive, intentional design, it tends to enhance learning. That when it's designed to reinforce skills or help students develop skills, then students tend to learn more.
Mhm.
However, student use does not generally align with that. Students tend to use it just to make the workload a little bit more manageable, a little bit easier, and to avoid those types of skills. So AI is a two-edged sword. It can help students learn more effectively by being available to them 24 hours for assistance
Mhm.
and to help refine their learning. But it can also be used as a shortcut. And we've got to build, if we're going to be using AI in our classes, we have to do it in a way that supports learning rather than skips the learning process.
And yeah, that reinforces our role as educators in helping facilitate using it in appropriate ways. So ethical issues around use of AI, copyright, intellectual property. Did you want to add anything?
Well, the main points there is that students should be aware that there are some ethical issues with how the training of AI took place.
Mhm.
That basically it grabbed everything it could. Much of it was not in public domain, it was not under Creative Commons licenses,
Mhm.
and it's using that to generate new content. Um, so it's something that students should be aware of, that there
Mhm.
are some ethical issues about that, and also that they should be careful with what they put into AI systems because in our case, where for Gemini, the data will not be used to train the system, but with any of the AI tools that students are more likely to use, because Gemini is not one of the most popular tools out there.
Mhm.
Most students tend to be using ChatGPT, or a few are using Copilot. I'm not quite sure why. But a few others are using
Yeah.
Claude, especially those who are doing some coding. But those systems in general, by default, will use information that they submit as
Mhm.
part of the training database, and then it becomes part of the information that could be shared with others.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are aware, or at least the debates around environmental impacts, the use of water and energy, and those are, pretty common critiques of AI use that are, starting to, enter the political debate on, at local levels and, building of data centers and how it impacts our energy bills and so forth.
However, the actual use of this is a tiny part of the actual use of energy. That in general, in Gemini, there was a study done last year, about a year ago, that found that a typical AI, a median query used as much energy and water as a 6 seconds of streaming video,
Mm.
or as a typical Google query of about 8 or 9 years ago. And the other study noted that it compared the amount of use used by crypto, and crypto use is taking about 10 to 15 times more energy and water use than than AI services are using.
Mm.
And when you think about the social benefit from that, with AI at least, there's some benefit. It does something to enhance productivity. Crypto is just basically this big gambling operation where it's like it's basically these fake currencies that are created where their scarcity is created by using a tremendous amount of energy, computing resources, and
Yeah.
water for no meaningful economic value. And we certainly have a president that encourages that right now. But at least with AI, there is some value that's being produced. There may
Mm.
be some questions about some of the output, but
Yeah.
um, it's not as bad as people suggest. And again, streaming
Yeah.
video takes a tremendous amount
Yeah.
of computing power and energy and infrastructure.
Certainly bias exists in large language models. They're using materials that are created by humans that have um, who are inherently biased, and thereby their results, the data it generates may reflect and maintain those biases. So things again to consider. Data privacy. Did you want to
Yeah, that
jump in there?
again, that goes back to the point I said earlier that if you're going to upload any information to it, that personally identifiable information, be really cautious. In general, it's best not to do that. But if you are going to upload any information with your own information, you probably should do it in something that's not being used to train the database or to train the model. So just be careful with that. Don't put in social security numbers. Don't put in students' information. Don't put in student names or
Right.
or their There's also a question of whether you should be submitting student work to it to get some feedback.
Mm,
You know, there's a lot of debate out there. Many instructors are already doing that to
right.
generate some first rounds of feedback that then they modify before they give it to the students. But be careful in terms of what you share.
Yeah.
Here are some links to a variety of AI syllabus statements, and there's many others out there, but another simple thing you can do is ask Gemini or one of the other AI tools to generate an AI statement. And if it doesn't specific to how you want to use it, tell the AI
Mhm.
platform what you want it to do, when you want it to be used, and when not. And it will generate a pretty decent statement, which you can then interact with as much as you want until you get to something you're happy with. Again, sharing with students and getting their opinions is also really useful. Oh, and this was a point I made before.
Yeah. Um, Always good to, discuss is the tilt approach, which Winklems, is that how I say her name?
Marion,
Winklemas, Winklemas, Marion Winklemas, has proposed that gives us clear structure and transparency in our assignments. So there's three elements to this: describing the purpose of the assignment, the task that can be completed, and the criteria for evaluation. And so to provide all of this information about appropriate AI use, ways not to use it within a tilt approach is a great use of adding that structure for students.
the most ineffective way of limiting AI use is just to tell students not to use it. If you can make a case to students explaining why you want them to do things without AI, they're much more likely to do it. Because in general, if you just tell your students AI use is not allowed in this class, they'll just think you're out of touch and they're going to mostly ignore that. The evidence on that is pretty clear, and we've seen a lot of cases of that. Um, but another possibility, and this is something that more and more instructors are doing, I'm not sure if anyone here is doing it right now,
Mhm.
but basically give students some options where you can give them different levels of AI use. So with different criteria for the assignments so that they're still getting to the same learning objectives. You might have an assignment where they do it entirely without AI assistance. You might have a variant
Mhm.
where they're doing it for some use with brainstorming, where you have them then reflect on that process. Or there may be another one where they're more actively engaged with in a more structured way with AI. And you can expect more of the quality of the work with each of those different levels, which is something that in the book Teaching with AI, the authors are escaping me.
It's like,
Um,
where's the book? It's around here
it's in the
somewhere.
other room. But in any case, yeah, in any case, giving students some choice because some students are very opposed to using AI. Not many, but some are. Other students really want to embrace it and use it productively, and giving them opportunities to do that is not a bad thing as long as it's consistent with the skills you want
Yeah.
students to develop in your courses.
Bowen and Watson
Yes. Yeah.
for the authors of the
Watson,
type.
because what he talked about there is basically just asking all students to use AI and just expecting much higher level work.
Mm.
That they suggested, in fact, that the type of output that AI can produce should be C or C minus
Mm.
level work, and you should expect more from all of our students. That would be quite a big lift for our
Sure.
students in general, but giving them those options is not a bad thing. And I did put together a couple of chatbots for Tilt, one in Gemini to be consistent with here, and a much better one that's available in ChatGPT. The chatbots in Gemini just are not as good as those um, in um, in ChatGPT, Claude, and others. However, if you're going to develop chatbot for your classes, Gemini is by far the best way to do that, even though the guardrails on them don't seem to be enforced as well.
Mm.
Um, but the advantage of using Gemini is all students will have the same access. I ran a chatbot group last year with people from multiple, well, from I think it was about 18 SUNY
Mhm.
institutions where they use chatbots. Some were using ChatGPT, some were using Gemini. And what they found is that in the classes where they were using ChatGPT, the students who had paid accounts got some really high quality support and were
Nice.
able to query it very extensively. The students who were using the free ChatGPT accounts quickly used up their queries and as a result weren't able to use them as fully, which disadvantaged the students in general from lower income groups. So with with Gemini, at least, all students have equal access, and
Mhm.
the context window that basically it has a lot. Even the basic free version, which is essentially what we have with the campus version, provides a lot of support. So students can use it pretty much as they want without it running out of tokens. But the tilt things are fun. If you don't want to create your own tilt assignments, upload the assignment, upload your course syllabus, or if you have a
Mhm.
rubric, upload that, and it will automatically put the assignment into the tilt framework, and it saves a lot of work, and it does a pretty good job with that.
So some of the kind of commonly cited inappropriate use of AI, like a lot of reasons students tend to turn to more inappropriate uses of AI is time pressure, grade anxiety, high stakes assignments, anything that, they are starting to feel like perfection over learning, feeling like they're imposters, stereotype threat, fixed mindset. Students, I know even the, couple of online classes that I've had where we've had issues of this, often it's because they feel like they don't quite know the expectations and they want to make sure that they're not failing to meet those expectations. And so by, making things more lower stakes and even acknowledging that they probably have some anxiety around first assessments and such can help tone down the inappropriate use of AI.
And what all these arguments come to some were summarized very nicely in one of the books we did for a reading group 2 years ago, which is the opposite of cheating,
Mhm.
and that the whole book was focused on that, and specifically in the age of AI.
Mhm.
Um, but another issue is who is most likely going to turn to AI. In general, it's the
Mhm.
students who are least prepared, which in general are the students who are most at risk because they were growing up, they were living in school districts where the funding was not great, where very few people were going to college, and
Mhm.
where they were not very well prepared for the type of work they were expected to do in college, which means, the students who are most likely to rely on
Yeah.
AI to do their work are the students who really need the most support anyway. And, they're not generally getting it when they turn to AI use.
So how to mitigate each of these things, I
So, yeah, so
mentioned,
what is your
yeah,
opinion? We've been
yeah,
doing a lot of talking.
yeah. Do that.
And if you're online, just either type something into chat or unmute.
What have you done, Rebecca? Not to totally put you on the spot, not to
Yeah, on
put
the
you on the
spot.
spot, but let me put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll admit what I've done in the past is I have syllabus statement.
Mhm.
I talk about it on the first day, and then I don't really talk about it after that, which is something I'm questioning, hence I'm being here. And so I think in general, like being more transparent is always a good option. And so uh, maybe like for each new assignment, bringing it up
Yeah.
preemptively. Um, and yeah, because my general view, right, is that it's a tool like any other. It can be used well, it can be used badly. And so it's rather than saying you can't use it at all, it's trying to encourage them to use it in a way that's going to benefit them in the long run without them just taking a few shortcuts
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah,
Find that zero tolerance hasn't worked
on
really for
anything
any
ever.
policy in ever, right? Like it just
Yeah.
isn't, it just isn't going to be as effective as I think, people kind of logically want to be drawn to. That I know for my classes, like I send individual emails, ask them to set up a meeting, and that has definitely give it and allowing them to redo their assignments. I try not to penalize my students for what I think is a very natural anxiety that draws them into AI use. Everyone's going to have different, opinions on that. But I've kind of long taken the stance that I do want to see their work. And to me, the cost of, penalizing them so that they don't end up doing their own work, is too high. So I tend to take a fairly, flexible approach in that, I'm going to give you time and I'm going to give you till, midterms to redo these assignments because it's important to me that that's, the learning that you're getting out of it, right? So I do think keeping it in conversation with students and really communicating to them how important it is to you that they learn the material or use the tools in a particular way, I think, does create that buy-in and that trust.
And allowing redos relaxes
Mhm.
some of the time pressure and the grade anxiety.
Mhm.
Scaffolding assignments so that they don't have as many high stakes assignments can be useful.
Yeah.
Having lots of low stakes assignments, having more formative assessments
Mhm.
which are either no stakes or, in terms of mastery learning, letting them do them over and over again
Right.
until they get a perfect score on those things. For a small proportion of the grade, some extrinsic motivation does help with that, because when I provided formative assessments that were optional, the only people who did that were the students in the top 20, 30% of the distribution.
Mhm.
And the students who most needed that
Right.
practice and work tended not to, because they were struggling with things, and that just seemed to add more work. But if they get credits for it, and if by redoing it they can get a higher score, that incentive is really enough to get them to do it, even if it's a tiny portion of the overall grade. In terms of the imposter syndrome and stereotype threat and fixed mindset, growth mindset messaging, which we've talked about a lot,
Mhm.
can also be helpful.
Carolyn or Dan, do you have any thoughts you want to share? It's okay if you don't, but
Um, uh, uh, I, I don't have an AI statement in my syllabus yet. I'm a teach math. It's a very low level math class. But I definitely talk about it on and off throughout the semester. And what I want to do is when I get collected work, it's obvious who has used it, is to anonymously, show the work that I got from the student. I would rewrite it myself, but and compare it to how we should be doing it, and to try to get students to understand. I mean, they're going to use it, but how to, I think you mentioned it earlier, evaluate the output they're getting and realize this is not how we're learning this. Um, or it's not, nobody could repeat the process. Like the information they get from AI is done in such a bizarre way that there's no way they could repeat the process. It's crazy. And I think I need to show them this more often. Like, here's one sample that a student gave me, and here's a different one. So they can look at different sources to to recognize the better
Mhm.
ways of, working problems out. So that's where I'm at.
Although the thinking versions of the models, the ones that are more slower, will describe the process by which it gets to the answer, and they're actually a lot more accurate than they used to be.
Mm.
There's been some really big improvements in the last 6 months or so.
Hmm.
And we are encouraged, the faculty assembly did pass a resolution, I believe, encouraging people to include an AI statement in the syllabus. It's not official policy yet, or maybe it was a recommendation from the provost that,
Mm.
at some point it will probably be required, but it is something that is recommended.
Yeah. I think, when you're engaging with students regularly with conversations about AI and doing, even structuring some assignments where you are comparing the output from a student versus AI. I think it does provide students with a different level of comfort about understanding your expectations, and finding more confidence in their ability to do the work. I think, those are good starting points for sure.
And math is an area where there's always mindset issues where people say, I'm
Yeah.
not a math person, and it's tough to get around that.
Yeah.
And my usually response when someone tells me that is, well, not yet, but the semester's not over.
Right. Oh, we sort of talked a little bit about this, or at least I did, in my approach with addressing inappropriate use is I do often, send with a lot of growth mindsets, messaging, that I do believe they can do the work on their own and that I want to hear their voice, even if it's messy, because I want their raw reactions to the readings and to the debates and topics that we're talking about. And, try to be a more positive enforcement of what my expectations are versus, trying to police their behavior and, be more punitive in their, um, in the consequences of using AI. So, I do try to be very transparent about this. I think I've had good experiences so far with students. Of course, there's always you know, I'm sure some experiences where it becomes trickier to be more flexible with allowing
And this is one of the points up on the screen that the authors of The Opposite of Cheating suggested that
yeah.
if you're going to allow students to redo work that they submitted with AI, that's effectively giving them an extension on any deadline. So if you're going to do
Yeah.
that, make sure it's clear to all students that if the work isn't acceptable, then
Mhm.
they can resubmit. Because otherwise, you're effectively creating an incentive that would encourage them to throw something together with AI, and if they're caught, they get to redo it anyway with extra time. So, if you're going to do that, it should either be available to all students anyway, or perhaps it could be some type of a grade penalty. So they could redo it maybe at half of the possible points or 3/4 or something. So just so that you don't create an incentive system that encourages the use of AI
Use of
and
AI.
gets closer
Yeah.
to the deadline.
So what do you do when students continue to deny AI use when it appears to be obvious? What's your experience with that, John?
It's often very frustrating. It just says, well, the most thing I'm most likely to do, and I've had to do this on far too many occasions, is to have students explain what they did on the exam or on the assignment. And when it's really clear that they don't understand what they submitted, then generally they will eventually say, well, yeah, I was getting close to the deadline and I did use this to generate part of this or something. I only remember one student who just kept insisting, on that, and that is frustrating.
Yeah. Almost always I've had students fess up to,
Yeah.
their use, especially when, and I tend to, I don't know if it's right or not, but I tend to not really leave it up for debate. I just say, I see that you've used AI on this. Here's how we can address it, and most of the time they're like, yep, yes, you did track that correctly.
Generally, most students, probably 99% of the students, okay, I've been doing this for a long time,
Yeah.
will admit to something, that they did. But this was an interesting approach that Anna Mills uses. She's one of the first people to really actively work with teaching with AI. And we had a podcast with her, but she uses an AI detector. Actually, I think she's using Turnitin's.
Okay.
And then when it gets over a certain threshold, she tells students that if this goes above this level, we're going to meet, we're going to discuss discuss this. She admits that AI detectors are inaccurate, so that she's acknowledging that it could be a false positive. but she does have students redo work that appears to have been redone by AI without an that appears to have been done with AI can be redone. But it's, that's an approach which is a little bit better than just accusing everyone of using AI.
Yeah.
We did have one person on campus a year or so ago who accused everyone in their class of using AI in an online class. And there's a good chance that they did. And that's one of the reasons why I stopped teaching online. But after 28 years of teaching online classes, because I was getting cases where nearly all the students seemed to be submitting even discussion posts with AI. And, I was facing a situation where I had a lot of students who were turning in superb things that were not entirely consistent with some of the things they did earlier in the semester, while other students were turning in mediocre work that was clearly their own. And I didn't want to continue a situation where I was giving students who were not learning very much high grades and students who were really struggling with material lower grades. And I just couldn't see a good way of addressing that in an asynchronous environment, given the type of class I was teaching, because it's something that's required in a major where students tended to have relatively low levels of quantitative skills. And it was just becoming the norm in that class. So I'm not teaching that anymore. And I feel bad about that. It was one of my favorite classes.
So Dan had to step out, but he did put a question into the chat, and he was asking our thoughts on the potential utility of grading contracts in this context. He said if it's recorded and posted, he'll check back later for the answer. Have you ever used a grading contract with students or a sort of
contract grading, but I'm not sure what a
I
grading contract.
think what he means is having students sign off
Oh,
admitting or not admitting, or at least agreeing to the context in which they're using AI or not using AI for an assignment. That was my understanding of the question.
there was a study of that done by Dan Ariely and some others. And it was one of those studies that was kind of debunked because of falsified data. And basically, there is no reliable evidence that signed contracts make a difference at this point. Now, maybe some new examples will come up, but someone at Harvard lost their job because of participation in this type of study with falsified data, what appears to be falsified data. So I wish it would have been really nice, because this one of the studies that was done was showing that if you put a contract at the beginning saying they agree to, to engage, meet the terms of the honors policy at my institution, even if there was no honors policy at the institution, they were less likely to cheat. Unfortunately, that data is just not that reliable right now.
So the data jury is still out on that question.
More research would be needed.
Yeah, that's good to know. I think that is too bad. That's
it's a cool study.
It's a cool study to have been totally made up.
Well, and allegedly it was randomized controlled experiments in a lab setting, which was,
yikes.
Well,
yeah. Well,
it involved having people do math calculations by circling pairs of numbers that added up to a certain amount, and they were self-graded. But in some cases, they used different types of prompts at the beginning of the survey. In one case, they had students list the 10 commandments, and in the that was a treatment group. In the control group, this wasn't quite the same, but in the control group, they listed 10 things they did last summer. And one of the things they noted in that study was that none of them got more than 4 or 5 of those 10 commandments. So this because it's not posted in their schools right now. Or in Congress. But what happened was it showed a significant difference, but I'm not sure we can believe that, given the other problems that were coming out of that lab.
Alternative assessments might shift some of the focus from getting A grades to actual learning. And I know we've talked a lot about alternative grading methods like ungrading and specifications grading and other tools that can allow us to shift that mindset onto learning. So considering evaluating the process of learning rather than the products, John has long done metacognitive reflections in his courses. Have you done that with AI in mind recently?
No, because I was doing it primarily in my
In your
online
online
classes
courses,
because it was a good way of getting them to reflect on the learning process.
Mhm.
Given the courses I'm teaching it, I do have students do some metacognition, exercises, but not at the same level as I used to do.
Mhm.
Um, but I think one of well, going back to the evaluating the process rather than the product
Mhm.
is really useful. That because, we were only getting indirect measures of the amount of learning that students did by looking at the final thing they produced without knowing very much about how they produced it. And with AI now, we can't count on the final product to measure or to
Mhm.
assess how
Right.
they're learning. So this can involve a lot more work, and that's something we have to be careful about. But if we could get students to reflect on learning, have them think about learning, have them keep a log of what they learned that week and so forth. Even simple things like using those classroom assessment techniques where students reflect each day, even with 1 minute quizzes at the end of class on what they learned
Mhm.
that day and what they are still confused by. That little bit of reflection in some studies, the results on this are mixed, but one of the largest results came in studies done in economics where instructors teaching multiple sections included a 1 minute quiz at the end of the class, just asking students, what did you learn? What don't you still understand? What don't you understand? And what would you like to learn more about? The classes sections where they use that reflection scored significantly higher, about a letter grade higher than the classes where they didn't do that. Other studies have found no significant effects in other disciplines. So the evidence isn't strong, but it does at least suggest that that could be useful. Now, one use of AI, which is kind of interesting and in a place where it's really controversial this week, is at Harvard, where an economist in the business school there developed something called all-day TA. And what that program does that's not the controversial thing. They also have now some AI clones of instructors where they sell courses right at $5.99, where the instructor is a clone of real Harvard instructor. But that's a separate issue. But what the all-day TA does is it actually tracks students' use in interactions with a chatbot, and the level of use was really intensive. That students use them very heavily, and at least on a weekly basis, it might have even been more frequently, instructors got feedback on what the students were asking about so they could adjust the content of the classes based on where students were having the most questions. That's one of only a couple of packages that I know of that will do that. But we're all struggling with how to build AI into assignments. And one thing we can do is ask AI how to do that and see if it has some suggestions. Because it is being trained on information from many faculty who are creating many things that are posted out there and that many students have submitted.
Right.
And there's more and more repositories of AI assignments out there, or AI assignments with AI integrated into them. SUNY has one where some of our faculty have contributed to that. There's some big repositories out there at Elon University and many others. So
Nice. Oh, I just had something.
Stanford, I think, also has.
Oh, Derek Bruff at our keynote address this past academic affairs retreat talked about doing an AI review of students' work and also doing a peer review, having them kind of all side by side and comparing the comments and feedback made by each group. That's something I'm gonna try to do this semester with my student project. So I'm looking forward to it.
PAIRR. In fact, there's chatbots that Anna Mills developed that are publicly available, or the prompts. You can grab those and then modify them for your use. And the peer review part is carefully set up so that it will not directly answer students' questions or give them something that they could submit, but it will guide them towards more effective writing and give them feedback on areas where they can improve without actually giving them changes that will make it. They're very well structured prompts, although
Nice.
the only problem is Gemini is not very good at holding to restrictions built into chatbots. It was very good at that until about March of the spring semester when they completely redesigned it, or they put a new release and it just completely ignored that. We were doing a podcast with someone who had built a whole course on this approach, and then all of the guardrails stopped working in the middle of the semester, which is
Oh, boy.
Of course.
very, very frustrating. And I was working with some people at Stony Brook where they had hundreds of students and the same thing happened. That he had very carefully
Jeez.
trained the chatbot to only be supportive without directly answering questions. And then it suddenly started answering all the questions, which required a lot more training and restrictions. Although if you set the default tool to work with it to guided learning, it's a
Mhm.
little bit better in Gemini than it was without that restriction.
Another plug for us being familiar with all the changes and updates too.
And that may be it.
That might be it.
So,
I mean,
questions, thoughts, any other ways of dealing with this? We're all struggling with this.
let's make sure. That's the
Yeah, you
last one.
just close that.
Oh, is that the last one?
Hmm.
Yep, all right.
Yeah, just hit the red. There we go.
There we are.
And then you could put any thoughts, questions, concerns? Carolyn, any?
No, just wanted to listen in on, try to get some other ideas today. With the semester starting up.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm not sure what I think about this, but I've seen stuff online about professors embedding sort of like a trap for students, putting it in white font kind of thing of whether insert some key thing like keyword that they obviously wouldn't write on their own.
Yes.
And like, I don't like the idea of trapping students, but it's a nice check. Do you do it and tell students that there's a check to make sort of preemptively deter it? I don't know. Just any thoughts on that?
It's easy to detect if students know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because they could
That's
always
what I
copy and
thought too,
paste it as
right?
text,
Yeah.
and then it would show up.
Yeah.
Or if they run it through a screen reader, it
Yeah.
would show up. So it's not foolproof. And the students who would be able to evade that are
Right.
students who are,
More savvy.
or more savvy.
Yeah.
in traffic. The main concern that most educational developers have about that is that it creates a climate of distrust.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like you're entrapping students with that. And there was a case of that just a month or so ago, where something like 95% of the students
Right.
had those things embedded in their assignment. And that suggests it may not have been the ideal environment anyway, that there was a pretty heavy culture of academic dishonesty there.
Right.
And but if you were going to take a class with that instructor after they had done this, it may make you not really trust that environment very well, because it's kind of a gotcha.
Yeah.
It works
Yeah.
for most students, but
I think also, the data show that we should be assuming everybody is using AI, right? For pretty much
for many things.
for many things. And so, I guess I would wonder what the utility of it is. And it's so if the utility is that you have a particular assessment that you absolutely don't want students using AI in, then I think you've got to rethink of, the way you are creating that assessment. So maybe it's an oral exam, or maybe it's, something that does remove that possibility. But I think, when you're integrating, AI is probably your better route
Yeah.
because of, given that it's likely going to be used anyway. What do you think? I mean, you've talked a little
My
bit
main
about,
concern would be
yeah.
the trust issue.
Yeah, I
you know.
was
Yeah.
kind of thinking, like, I saw it, and like my first reaction was I laughed, and then
Yeah,
I was
me
like
too.
thinking about actually using it, and it felt icky.
Yeah.
I think because of that.
It's discouraging to hear that many students.
Exactly.
And
So.
the other big case of this was the economics course at Brown, a course on game theory, where
Yeah.
they told the class at midterm
Yeah.
that it was gonna be a take-home thing and they should not use AI. Because what would happen is at the final exam, he would look at the distribution, and if there was a significant difference in the distributions, he would not count the midterm. And it ended up with like 2/3 of the class failing the final because they had got nearly perfect scores on the midterm and end up getting scores like 20,
That's
30% on
amazing.
the final exam. So, those are two of the big prominent cases out there, just showing how commonly used these things are.
Right.
Because with survey data, I put some statistics up about the number of students who've used AI in supporting assignments. But when they're asked directly if they've used AI to complete the entire assignment, students generally only report 20 to 30% of them use it. But when you look at cases like that, it's not quite consistent with that. So I don't know. I wish it was a better way. I think to the extent like the pair process that Anna Mills and the people out in
Yeah.
California developed is a good way of doing it, because they're submitting what they had originally created, what AI feedback gave them, and what their own and the feedback they use themselves, and then they reflect on how they combined it and so forth. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But again, it can be a lot more work, and a lot of people are having people use AI, but then just submit the interactions with it. And what the person on the podcast who was
Yeah.
using a chatbot was replacing a textbook, where he took open
Interesting.
materials and generated a chatbot for each module of the course, where students would interact with that, and then they would complete an assessment that was then submitted and reflect on that whole process. And they basically just submitted a link to all their discussions. A fun type of thing, and I've mentioned this a few other times, is programming a chatbot to reflect, say, a historical figure in your discipline, and then querying them about something where you're evaluating them on the quality of their interactions, of what types of questions they're asking and how they're responding. Or chatbots that are created to be contrary and always disagree with anything someone posed, so they could strengthen their arguments and so forth. Having students submit something to AI and then and asking it to critically evaluate it, and then making changes and submit the whole process. Again, is a lot more work to evaluate than just a final paper, but at least you get to see more of how they interacted with it. I don't know. Any other thoughts, or Maggie? You're coming back
I
to this
know,
after skipping much of it.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely something I don't know if looking forward is the right, emotion, but it's going to be a new challenge for me. I've taught a couple of online courses where AI was starting to gain more traction in it. But yeah, this will be kind of, the first in-person class where I'm, engaging with students on the issues of AI. So it'll be interesting. It's definitely a lot to think about, for sure.
I liked the metaphor of the forklift in a gym that was at the keynote speaker.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to share that with my intro students.
Because they recognize that. They don't
Yeah.
bring a
Yeah.
forklift to the gym.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good seeing you.
Yes.
Yeah. Good luck with the new semester.
Thanks.
Yes. Stop the recording. The top right now.
Okay. I was like, where is that at?
Yeah, it's moved around. It's at the bottom if it's still